Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to our very first LA event, our third event, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the sponsors who have helped us put this on. When I first started this event in 2023, my wife made me promise that I wasn't going to lose money. I didn't. I made a very small amount of money on that first event. But really, it just wouldn't be possible without these folks who are supporting interesting work in AI and interesting conversations in AI. So a huge thank you to all of them. You'll hear from them today. So I've started every one of these talks exactly the same way, which is that today is for questions. As much as has changed in the last 3 years, not that much has changed. I think there are still a lot more questions than there are answers when it comes to AI and marketing. And I really want to sort of encourage this to be a space where that is the focus. The focus is on the questions and not the answers. In that spirit, we get this question a lot, which is, how do you pronounce this? It's not brand X. It's not BRXND. And it's not BRXND, which is like by far my least favorite of them. I just call it brand. This is all sort of a little accidental. This whole conference really was born out of a feeling that we could just have better conversations in the industry about AI, and that too many people were focused on the wrong things, and there were too many stages across marketing events that were full of 4-person panels who had never touched ChatGPT before. So, I thought we could do something better. For those of you who haven't been to one of these events, these are the programming tenets. And hopefully this is sort of what you're gonna feel throughout the day. Try to sort of bring doers over speculators as much as possible. That means people who are actually sort of doing things. The folks from brands that we've brought are really encouraged to talk about the process. Like, how did you get through legal review and actually make this thing happen? Because that's what we all are trying to figure out right now. Curiosity over overconfidence. I think, I'll end this talk with this, but I'll sort of give away now, which is my general sort of take on AI is that you shouldn't trust anyone that sounds too confident about what they're saying. When you hear from the people who are even producing the foundation models, they're not totally confident on where this is going to go and what's going to happen and exactly what these models can do and how they're going to work. Conversations over panels is just a personal pet peeve of mine, which is we're going to have one-on-one conversations today. There's no panels throughout the day. I think panels are just terrible, and I think they should be abolished from every marketing event. So I'm doing my small part in making that happen. Showing over telling, so really just as much as possible, encouraging people to show the things they're doing. We need less AI talk and more AI action. And then finally, just process over perfection, right? This idea that, we're all living through this now. Like, very few of us had played much with AI before 3 years ago. And so, we're all trying to figure it out. And then the last one is that while today is for questions, we don't do audience questions, which again is just sort of a personal pet peeve, but I can't stand the thing where people stand up and give a 5-minute soliloquy that ends at a question mark. And so I am sure you all have amazing questions. This is a very different group of people, but we're gonna save them for the conversations that can happen throughout the day. There's plenty of time to talk to everybody. We've got an amazing space. We'll do something afterwards. So don't be offended by that, please. So originally I had titled this talk AI 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. And what I really wanted to talk about was sort of the realities and the challenges that I think, I certainly have felt, and I think probably many of you have felt in trying to kind of move this new technology into some of the world's largest brands. It takes a lot of work, it turns out, right? It takes a lot of energy to push it through. As I was sort of sitting down to write it, I kept running into this problem, which is that we now live in a world where you can just build anything at any time. And I found myself getting sidetracked. So one day I was like, I think the way I need to write this talk is that I need to hook up model context protocol, which is Anthropic's way of having the model talk to your computer. And if I could just have access to all my notes, that would make it much easier for me to write the talk. And so that was like sort of, a few hours of getting that going and making it work. And then when that wasn't good enough, I decided that I was going to build my own local retrieval augmented generation system. So I was going to take all my notes, I was going to dump them into a vector database, I was going to chunk them in exactly the way I wanted them, and it was going to help me write my whole talk. So that was another day. And then probably the most ridiculous of them, and maybe the least sort of directly related to this talk, is that I decided it would be funny if I built a super inefficient assistant who I could copy on emails to ask to schedule things, but would write the worst scheduling emails you could possibly imagine. And so Georgie here will respond in a second with a completely terrible email back. So, the whole point here is to really make it terrible. This meeting will never happen. And obviously this didn't have a lot to do with me writing my talk, but this was another few hours. This is Georgie's prompt. So Georgie is, encouraged to be longer than necessary whenever possible. Just to ensure for alignment type phrases always, uses lots of acronyms without defining them. That's an important thing. Use coordination terms, align, sync, and then always include lots of bullet points when offering scheduling options to make things as confusing as possible. Then, of course, because I'm an addict, I had to buy a domain and put up a website. And so I called it SSFM. And it is providing exceptional executive support to a select group of distinguished leaders, invite only, ssfm.pro. And so you might be wondering why SSFM, or maybe you're not, maybe you just think I'm out of my mind. But I called it SSFM because I thought it was a funny sort of play on this manual that was produced by the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And they produced this manual that they then distributed throughout Nazi-occupied Europe in 1944 to citizens of Nazi-occupied countries to encourage citizen saboteurs, right? So like small-scale sabotage. And it was this secret document that was distributed secretly. And it encouraged things like when destruction is involved, the weapons of the citizen saboteur are salt, nails, candy, pebbles, thread, or any other materials he might normally be expected to possess. Specific instructions for janitors include keep lots of oily substances in a big bucket so that they can easily catch fire. And if they don't accidentally easily catch fire, you can always throw a match or a lit cigarette in them. But maybe most interestingly, and if any of you have ever seen this document, probably the reason that you've seen it, is the sabotage instructions for office workers. Those sabotage instructions include things like make speeches, talk as frequently as possible and at great length. When possible, refer all matters to committees, always. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible to just sort of gunk up the works a little bit. Haggle over precise wording, right? So we need to make sure it's perfect. Always go back on previously agreed upon decisions and make sure you relitigate them. And then last but not least, advocate caution. Everybody should think about this, slow down, make sure we don't make any decisions in haste. Interestingly, apparently, this whole thing was fairly effective. I mean, it's sort of impossible to know if this specific document was the source, but many of the factories that had previously operated very efficiently after Nazi occupation, the defect rates went crazy. And so there is some evidence that this was actually happening. But the corporate side of it is, it's a pretty amazing sort of snapshot from 1944 that, if we're being honest, feels like it could very easily live today. So as my friends were battling with my fake assistant who was working out a matrix for choosing the optimal fish-forward restaurant for us to dine at that evening, I had this realization that like actually my sort of, my biggest digression from writing this talk was the talk. That, you know, really, that is the point I was interested in making, which is like, you know, the reason I wanted to talk about the sort of perspiration versus inspiration is because it just takes work to move this stuff through to change large organizations, right? We are all fighting bureaucracy. That's the reality of the situation when you work inside or with large companies. When I look back at the very first one we did of these in 2023, you know, I was sort of like kind of sure that we would never do another one, partially because I was not sure I really wanted to be doing events, and partially because I thought maybe just like the entire marketing industry would fully adopt AI by the end of 2023, and we just wouldn't need to really talk about it anymore. I was wrong. I was very wrong. I'm glad that we're still talking about it. I think you all wouldn't be here if this wasn't a topic worth discussing. But you know, I did sort of have that feeling. You know, I mean, for me, as somebody who writes code and builds things, like this has been the most amazing few years of my life. Like I feel like I've just sort of been unlocked and I can do anything at any time. And obviously the sort of, you know, the speed with which AI has moved throughout the world is pretty extraordinary, right? Like when you look at this chart of, you know, just how quickly ChatGPT got to 100 million users, it's a pretty mind-blowing thing. This is unquestionably one of the fastest technology adoptions in history. But, you know, while all that has been happening, you know, we're still humans, and more than that, for those of us, you know, we're here to talk about marketing. Like we're not just humans; we're humans inside these large machines, right? And it just takes time and energy for things to move through them. And you know, as much as people want to say this is sort of the biggest moment of technological change in the history of the universe, I sort of like to remind them that like one day this dude woke up and his friends had figured out how to make fire, and like, that was probably a pretty crazy moment of technological change. Like you go to sleep and the next morning you can cook things. And so, you know, I think that's just sort of the reality of the world that we live in, is like, it is changing, it is evolving, and we're all sort of dealing with it. There's this great framework from a guy named Adam Gopnik. He's a writer for The New Yorker. He wrote this piece in probably 2010, that was a look, it was a book review actually, about sort of books about technological change. And in it, he sort of broke it down into these three groups. So you had better nevers, those were the dystopians. They were the ones who sort of feel like every new piece of technology is ruining the world, right? It's sort of the end of society. And then you have the never betters, they're the utopians. You know, I'm sure we know some of those. Every new bit of technology is gonna solve every problem, and that's gonna be it, and we're gonna be all good. And then in the middle, he had these ever-wasers. And the ever-wasers essentially see these sort of moments of great technological change as like a key part of being human, and that like what makes something a modern moment is that we're living through it, right? And that, you know, that proto-human who, you know, lived through fire, and we lived through printing, and we lived through the invention of the written word. Like these are all these sort of huge moments of technological change. And, you know, fundamentally you sort of have to see them over this kind of really large cycle. And I feel like that's sort of very much my view, and that's, I think, personally think is the right view to have on this thing, which is like, yes, this is an amazing moment. It is going to change things. It is already changing things. It will take more time than we think it's going to take, because it's always going to take more time than we think it's going to take. That's just how change works. And, you know, even when we talk about sort of bureaucracy, sort of one of the most important kind of moments in my career was this kind of flip of thinking that I had probably partway through my work at Percolate, which was a company I founded in 2011, which was, you know, we were working with these giant companies, and we had this sort of pain of like seeing them try to move new technology through the system. And, you know, I always felt like, well, they're acting irrationally, or they're like, they should be doing this faster, they should be doing it more. And I sort of finally flipped it and I said, no, it's like, actually, I think, bureaucracy is kind of a good thing in a way, right? Like bureaucracy exists inside these large companies to protect their assets. Like that's why it works that way. These giant companies have a giant amount of profit and a giant product, and making sure that you don't screw that up is really important. And it makes sense that there's a lot of things inside very large organizations that exist to protect that. And so, I actually don't think bureaucracy is a bad thing at all. I mean, it certainly can be a bad thing. And for those of us in this room, it can be a very frustrating thing because we're often tasked with pushing against that bureaucracy. But it exists for a very good reason, right? Which is that these are amazing businesses and they want to stay amazing businesses. And so I think in a way, like, if we go back to sort of the point of the talk, I think, I sort of realized it's not really how do we fix the bureaucracy, because it's an impossible task, right? Like, I mean, if you have a small enough company where you don't need bureaucracy, that's great. But if you work in, a Fortune 500 business, which many of you do, the bureaucracy exists for a reason. There should surely be less of it, but the sort of fundamental is there. The question is more, how do we work within it, right? Or put another way, I think, how do we sabotage the sabotage? And that's sort of what I've been feeling lately. For me, I've got this sort of important story in my sort of life of playing with AI, which is that in April of 2023, I think, ChatGPT released plugins. And plugins were just sort of a way you could integrate ChatGPT in with other applications. And I had applied to get access to build a plugin, and I got access. And I was like, cool, I canceled all my meetings that day. I was like, I'm just gonna build a plugin today. That's what I'm gonna do. And so I did the thing you do when you build plugins, which is you go read the API docs, right? So you sort of learn how they work. Whenever you're integrating two systems together, that's what you do. I've spent a lot of my career integrating software. And so, I've read a million API docs that look something like this, right? And they all look the same. This is Meta Docs, but it could be Amazon Docs, it could be Google Docs, it could be anything, right? Essentially, the way APIs work is that there's a big vendor and you're trying to integrate something with them, and they tell you how you should send them data, and they tell you how they're gonna send you data back, and as long as you follow those rules, everything is gonna work fine. And so then I go to the OpenAI docs, and it says something completely different. It says that what you have to do for OpenAI is that you have to just put a file in the root of your product, and in that file, you describe how you want them to send you data, and you describe how you're gonna send data back to them, and they'll make the rest work. And many of you have probably not been responsible for integrating software before, but this is a completely insane, mind-blowing thing if that's your responsibility. This is like completely flipping on its head how the world works. And the reason they can do that is because AI can act like this fuzzy interface, right? And so the reason they can handle data of any shape is because they're just sticking AI on the end of it, and they're gonna put it back into the shape that they actually need it, right? AI, I talk about it a lot, as acting like this sort of fuzzy interface. And that to me is sort of probably the biggest magic of AI. Like, I think while certainly in this industry, there's a lot of focus on using it for creative and using it for all these other purposes, and there's amazing things, many of which we'll see today. I think, if there's one kind of functionality that is most transformative, it's this ability to just stick AI in the middle of anything and to kind of make them connect. So if we're kind of like following the story through though, like, isn't this what digital transformation was supposed to do? Like, wasn't this supposed to sort of solve for these same kinds of problems? Wasn't it supposed to push against that bureaucracy that was described in 1944 by the Office of Strategic Services? And it was, but the reality that we live in is slightly different, which is that, what was actually sort of delivered out of the world of digital transformation was a whole bunch of new boxes that were all the same for every single company that people needed to fill out, and that included ever more drop downs and inputs that were required of them, right? With very little care for the person at the end. I'm going to have to let this play for one more second because the very end is, somebody asked me, I told somebody about this and they asked me my favorite part of this. This is all built by AI. This is a tool called V0, which can generate UIs for you on the fly. There's a part of this, my favorite I think is that it asks for 3 different approvers, so you need a backup, then a second backup. So the real problem here though is there's not just one of those, right? There's 20 of them. They're everywhere, and what we've done in the last 20 years inside large organizations, I think, is sort of try to replace one bureaucracy with a different one, right? And in an effort, when we go to integrate them, that's the sort of dream. It's like, okay, we're going to sort of fix this new problem we've created by making them all fit together. But the problem is that, we get API docs like this where there's 600 different APIs available to us. They don't look like OpenAI, right? It's not just a sort of invitation to send data however you want and receive data however you want. They're very much sort of locked into their way of working, and they, the sort of these large scale systems are sort of imposing on us the way that they want to work. And I was sort of trying to kind of think of how to visualize this, and I turned to Midjourney, and it's sort of I feel like AI is this goo, right? It can sort of get into all the kind of cracks, and that's what's so amazing about it. It sort of can spread itself out, and it doesn't really care. And then every night before bed, I have a 7 and a 9-year-old, and we watch YouTube videos before bed. And one of the channels we like to watch is Veritasium, which is an excellent science YouTube channel. I would suggest to any of you, whether you have kids or not. But then we watch this video on superglue, and I was like, oh, that's it.
Superglue in the tube is a liquid of identical monomer molecules. The molecule is ethyl cyanoacrylate. When you put it between 2 surfaces, the liquid flows into all the pores and crevices. Then the monomers start reacting with each other, joining to form long polymer chains. This turns the glue from a liquid into a solid. And at this point, it can no longer be pulled out of the cracks and crevices, so it's stuck in place, and the 2 surfaces are connected. If you're ever trying to glue surfaces that are too smooth, this is probably the reason superglue sticks poorly. There are few crevices or pores for it to cling to. To fix this, you can sand the surfaces to introduce some surface texture. That way, when the liquid glue solidifies, it's stuck in the cracks.
And so this is sort of my nooks and crannies theory of AI, which is I think this is kind of how AI works, is it's really amazing at being able to sort of get into all those little places, all those sort of nooks and crannies within organizations, and it doesn't have to care, it doesn't have to change them. And I think that's what's sort of so mind-blowing about having this kind of fuzzy interface. My sort of example of this for my life is back in my Percolate days, we used to do these things called field reports. So every salesperson who worked at Percolate, every time they had a meeting, they had to go into Salesforce, not this interface, but I no longer have access to that Salesforce, so I had to find a screenshot. But they had to go in and they had to write up their notes from the meeting, right? So they'd go and they'd say, what did the client say? What did you say? All the sort of basic things that you would expect to put into Salesforce. And then it would go out to everybody. And essentially, it would be our sort of recap of what happened, and it would be the history of all of these meetings that occurred. But the problem was no one essentially, except for James and I, who ran Percolate, were willing to read all of these things. And so then we had to have status meetings as well, to go over all the field reports that had gotten written, right? And so it's you sort of end up seeing how these kinds of bureaucracies sort of build up even inside large organizations. And now in building a new company, it's just so amazing to sort of be living in a world where, we just record our calls, we then pull them into our own systems. We have the AI write those field reports for us now, and then they go out to Slack, and then at the end of the week, they all get summarized and we get a full account status of everything that happened. And it's just amazing to kind of have technology that works however you want to work, right? And I think that's the sort of mindset shift that really happens with AI, is we don't have to change our ways of working in order to fit into its inputs and drop-downs, it can just sort of wrap itself around whatever way we prefer. Well, over the last sort of year or two, I've done some interesting projects that I can't share all of, but I can talk a little about, and I think they also sort of represent kind of interesting kind of notes in this. One of them is worked with a big professional services firm, and we ended up pulling all of their competitive content and all of their content in order to help folks inside the firm understand how different what they were saying was from their competitors. And the point of it was not to like call people out, although it kind of was, but it was to just sort of, it was to be a kind of honest voice and say, hey, like, we just need to kind of be realistic that this has been said 3-4 times. We did a project with a large consumer brand where we took a sort of global brand strategy and we helped to allow local markets to sort of test their ideas against it. It didn't say yes or no. It didn't say like, don't do this or do it. What it did was it said, hey, here's sort of how that lines up with that global strategy. If you decide to do it, here's some sort of ways you might approach it. And what I think is interesting about these things is like, it just sort of works inside the existing system. And in both of those examples, actually, what was really sort of fascinating was the real role of AI was as this sort of arbiter of previously agreed upon justice. So if we go back to the sort of, bureaucracy principles, like always go back and relitigate previously decided things, AI is really amazing because frequently when you do that, right, if you build a strategy and then you sort of want to break it, whoever is sort of more senior gets to make the final decision. And AI doesn't care about that, right? And so in this way, these tools sort of become this kind of independent arbiter, right? To say, hey, this is the thing we decided on, this is how we want to be, and I don't care that you are the CMO or you are not, this is sort of how we decided. Now, you could decide to change it, you can decide to go against it, it's not making the decision for you, but having this sort of independent voice is a very interesting kind of piece of the puzzle. And so, to kind of wrap it up, I thought it would be interesting to try to put together, my sort of simple sabotage field manual. So like, what can we do as people who work inside these large organizations who are trying to drive change we believe is positive? Where are our sort of points of leverage and how can we start to kind of push things forward? And, I've got these 6 of them. I'm going to go through each one individually. But there's sort of lessons learned from many conversations, from 3 years of these events, from working with a whole bunch of very large brands. The first one is just like start at the bottom, right? And so I put together this triangle. This is sort of how I have thought about kind of how to approach bringing AI into organizations. And the bottom is access. And I think this is sort of the piece the most organizations skip, ironically, in trying to kind of really integrate it. There are so many organizations who sort of try to push AI programs forward before they give everyone in the organization access to AI. And the challenge with that, beyond the fact that it's just kind of ridiculous, is that this is just such a weird technology that we're all getting a feeling for, that like to not give them access and not to let them sort of imagine means that like it's going to be significantly harder to find those use cases, right? Because if you haven't played with it enough, you can't really imagine what it can do. Again, this is like this moment of realizing it was a fuzzy interface when I got access to build a ChatGPT plugin 3 years ago. It's like it required being there with my hands on it to sort of fully see how mind-blowing this was. It's not a thing you can read about, right? It just doesn't work that way. And so I think, access is the sort of foundational piece. Without that, everything is much, much harder. The other way to sort of view this is to think about it across these dimensions. Access exists in this sort of bottom left. There's a ton of day-to-day work that lives in that bottom left. Low complexity, low impact, but it really matters to you. This is the most annoying little bits and pieces. My sort of like bottom left example is, the annoying thing when you're copying something from one place to another and you need to redo the bullet points. I just give that to AI all the time. It's the most dumb example to tell people, right? Obviously, that has like no business impact, but man, that makes my life significantly easier. And so, it's just like we don't wait. That's a big theme that you will continue to hear in these. But, we just have to sort of go with what we have. And we really, I think, inside these organizations, need to start with ensuring that people have access to this stuff because people are not going to be able to imagine what they can do with it until they get their hands on it and they can play with it. The second one is about what I call private tokens. So, I think there's a lot of confusion in the sort of industry and in the market about sort of what AI can do and what it can't do. And I was recently listening to a podcast with an amazing researcher named Alison Gopnik. I would suggest you all pay attention to her. She's at Berkeley. She's a child psychologist researcher who also does AI work. And so she has this very interesting sort of early childhood development and learning view of the world that she's applying to AI. But she talked about AI in terms of a story that some of you may have heard. It's called Stone Soup. So Stone Soup is a story about these people. They sort of land on this island. They have no food, and they go to the locals on the island, and they ask them if they have any food. And the locals say no, they can't share any food with them. And so they say, okay, we'll just make some stone soup. So they go and they get a pot, and they ask if they can have a pot, and they fill it with water. And they go grab some stones, and they put some stones in. And then they say to the village, they taste it, and they're like, well, it would really be better if it just had some carrots. And so somebody's like, oh, I got a carrot. I can give you a carrot. We can put that in. And so they heat it up. They keep going. They mix it, and they're like, it would really taste better with some parsley. And so somebody's like, I got some parsley. And you see how it's going. Then somebody's like, hey, it tastes better with some chicken. Somebody's got some chicken. And at the end, they're like, you see, it just took 2 stones. And that's sort of the story of AI as Gopnik tells it, which is, like we talk about AI as if it's this sort of magical technological breakthrough, and in many ways it is. And that, as if the only things required were transformers and gradient descent. We're all good. We just need lots of GPUs. But then they came along and they were like, man, it would be really good if we had like every piece of writing humans have ever done. That might like really help us train the models. And we're like, yep, got it. I got the internet. We can do that. And then they're like, well, it would be, be really great if you guys could like thumbs up, thumbs down this stuff. So we had reinforcement learning with human feedback, and we're like, yep, got it. And then at the end, they're like, you see, it was just transformers and gradient descent. That's all it took. And we keep layering in. You have to do prompt engineering. You have to do these pieces. So we are a sort of fundamental piece of this puzzle. Even though, it often can feel like it's this sort of independent technology that exists without humans. I think a lot about this sort of triangle, which is that, when I look at sort of what works best out in the world right now, it's at this sort of intersection of AI, which is essentially unmetered intelligence, expertise, which is, folks like yourselves who exist inside these organizations who know how to do things unbelievably well, and code. And the code ultimately represents being able to build multi-step workflows. In some ways, it's just making up for the fact that these models are not quite smart enough to do anything on their own. And at the bottom of that are the private tokens, right? And so by private tokens, I mean sort of all of the knowledge that doesn't exist on the internet, right? It's all the stuff that exists inside the company, exists inside your head. It's all the ways of working that hasn't been explicitly stated, or maybe has been explicitly stated, but certainly would never be made public. It's all the sort of competitive differentiation that exists inside brands. And what's so important about this is that essentially, sort of in my view, and you can argue about whether it should be at 50% or 60%, but the public models, when you just plug something into ChatGPT, I think a decent way to sort of envision it is to think that like you are getting the median response. Right? It's taken every piece of writing from the history of people, and it is giving you the sort of average of that, right? And if you want to go higher than the median response, which is what is required when you work inside a giant organization, then you need those private tokens, right? You need the things that you do uniquely that are the differentiation for you. So the next one, this is about explore, exploit. Explore, exploit is a sort of favorite computer science idea of mine. It's a way to think about sort of how do you solve problems when you have to look over a large space, right? And so in computer science, often you're trying to find the sort of optimal solution. This is how machine learning works, right? So you're trying to sort of find the best way to train the model to get it to sort of complete words. And theoretically, you could do that forever, and you could keep trying to make it more and more and more perfect. But there's this point where you get diminishing returns, right, naturally. And so you have to sort of cut it off. We can't just keep doing it forever. And that's explore, exploit. That's the idea. So your explore is you're trying to find all the sort of best possible options. You're trying to look through, you're trying to do a sort of wide exploration of the space. And exploit is you decide on the approach and you go deep, right? My sort of other way of describing this is think about Indiana Jones, which is that, you know, we often think of Indiana Jones out in the field, but in reality, he was a researcher and an academic. He spent a lot of time in libraries, right? That's a good place to do your exploration. And he spent a little bit of time in the field. And that's where, when he finally made the decision of where to go, where the Lost Ark was going to be, you know, he went out and he found it. And so, you know, in thinking about that in the sort of world of AI, I think, you know, we have really interesting kind of changes in the roles. Large companies are very much set up to be on the right side of this, right? Like when you become a large company, you have developed a product that people want, and your goal is to deliver that product as efficiently as possible. This is how the world works. And you get really good at things like operations, right? But that's not where we are with AI right now, right? We're not really in the exploit phase of things. We're very much in explore, and that just requires a different mindset. It requires different ways of working. And I actually think it, really importantly, it requires this sort of different skills and sets of people. This is something I've been working on a lot. This is something I would love to talk to folks about. I'm sure many of you are thinking about this as well. What is the skills matrix when you're hiring people to work with AI? What do you need? You know, it's like, I think I've got these must-haves. You've got to be a systems thinker. You've got to be curious. But it's really, we're in this interesting moment. And, you know, I think the people who are seeing success, and lots of the people you hear from today, are very much explorers, right? They're people who live on that sort of left side of the continuum. And they're partnering with the people who live on the right as they find the solutions, right? Because ultimately, to make them successful, they do have to scale inside these companies. So the next one here is finding the painful interfaces, right? This is sort of where we think about those areas that have been sanded down. You know, this is just a thought about where you might find them, right? So, you know, we have all these information bottlenecks inside companies, these places where, you know, everybody is waiting for the CMO's sign off. That is a great place for AI. Like, why shouldn't you have a place where the CMO can, where you can get sort of early version of CMO feedback synthetically, right? Information bottlenecks are fantastic. Fuzzy opportunities, places where you need to translate data. You've got a person whose job it is to take the Excel that somebody sends and change it into your campaign reporting format. Like, that is a terrible job that probably many of us in this room have done. It's just a perfect place to put this kind of stuff. And so, you know, I think, again, in thinking about sort of working within the bureaucracy, finding those sort of rough spaces where you can occupy. The next one here is just build for mind blown. This is a favorite change framework of mine. I hope you all have a favorite change framework, but this is mine. This was developed in the early 90s within the world of education, actually. And the way to read it is essentially, you know, those sort of blue or periwinkle boxes. That's if you leave one of those out. And then on the right, you see what happens, right? So if you leave out vision, you get confusion in an organization. If you leave out incentives, you get resistance. And I've just sort of always loved this. I think, you know, any of you who have ever sort of worked inside the world of education know it's a hard place to move things. And I think, you know, there are a lot of really good people who have spent a lot of time thinking about how to kind of drive worlds like that forward. That is a heavily bureaucratic space. And this is just a sort of, I think, a really helpful way to think about change generally. We've developed this sort of like slightly different version, which is thinking about kind of how do you apply that within the world of AI. And I think, you know, what I feel like is, we often see AI plus expertise, and you get like really amazing capability enhancement, but if you're missing the code, you sort of don't get the whole picture. I think a lot of the tools that we try to use are trying to just be code plus AI, right? And it doesn't know how you work. And so, it's like we built this summarizer thing. Every notes product, every call recorder will summarize your notes. I just don't like them. I don't think it works for me. It doesn't sort of answer the questions that are most important to me. And I think when you put all those things together, and that, again, goes to that sort of triangle, I think you see real sort of amazing things happen. So the last one of these is just build things. And hopefully that's sort of a theme throughout the day. And that's something I just want to encourage everyone. And it's the reason I put this event on in the first place is I just want us, we're going to talk today, but I want us to talk less about AI. I want us to do more of it. I think we've got to stop waiting for permission. We've got to learn by building. Again, we're in those sort of early phases. We're very much in explore. Stay away from obvious roadblocks. I think one of the things I see most often inside large companies is like their very first ideas. What if we could search every piece of customer data that we have with an AI? And you're like, that is the worst first project you could ever possibly imagine. And so like, it's going to take you 3 years to get access to that data. Do not start there. Show some progress, get your feet wet, do some stuff that does not require the most sensitive data the company has, please. And then the best way to understand AI is really to just use it. Plus, don't trust anyone that sounds too confident. Please, that's like most important thing is stay skeptical on all this stuff. Like get your hands on it, feel it for yourself, build your own opinion, build your own, I call it, there's a German word called Fingerspitzengefühl, which is fingertip feeling. Build your own fingertip feeling. That's hopefully some of what we'll do today, that's some of what we'll talk about today. Hopefully some of you will be inspired to take some of this back to work with you, but that's really sort of the goal. Hopefully that sets the tone. Hopefully that gets everybody thinking. So with that, I want to thank you, but I'm not going to leave.